Okay, it's Tuesday, the 13th of October, about 11:30 in the morning, and we're going to run another test based on our successful last test with our squeeze bulb bypass. This time, we are capping off the nipple coming out of the cap, so there's no vent. Instead of using that clear tubing to vent the interior tank, we are going to try to use the bypass around the squeeze bulb to see if the interior tank can find a vent through the same vent that vents the exterior tank in the cap of the exterior tank. So the fuel quantity inside the generator is right about even with the bottom of the filter, and on the exterior tank it's right about even with the seam on the back side. Okay, it's actually almost noon now. It's about 5 minutes before noon, and I finally satisfied myself that I got a good suction going, a good siphon. I actually had to take off the upstream hose, the bypass hose, and work the squeeze pump, and I took the cap off of the generator and satisfied myself that I had a good siphon going, and then I reassembled everything, and I used the screwdriver to depress the valve in the fuel line and satisfied myself that I had a good siphon going. So now I'm going to crank up the generator and start the test. Okay, well, as usual, one pull was all it took to start that generator. I'm going to turn on the 600 watt load. You know what? I'm going to use the 900 this time to give it more of a load. So the interior tank was only about half full. You heard the electronic speed control kick up as we turned on the load, and this fuel level is just about here, just about this writing beneath the seam is where we're starting at noon on the 13th. Well, this is very interesting. It was about 5 minutes after 2 o'clock, so the generator ran for about 2 hours under the load, and I happened to be standing right next by when it stopped. And I came over, removed the cap, and the reason it stopped was because it exhausted all of the fuel inside the internal tank. And for some reason, as you can see right now, the siphon is not working. I guess there's just not enough altitude, but it worked in the past. But if I lower the cap down a little bit more, then the siphon starts again. So what I'm going to try to do is raise the external tank up on top of those black cases there to get a little bit more elevation and see if that gives us a good siphon, and if so, then I'm going to start the test again. Oh, this is so fascinating. So I have placed the external tank on top of those black cases to get us another 6 or 7 inches up, and now when I move the fuel cap down to this level, it's flowing. We've got a good siphon going there. As you can see, it's filling up the cap, so that's going to be about right there. So I'm going to put the cap back on again and start the generator and continue the test. Well, it's just fascinating. The fuel level still seems to be about right there at the level of the writing on the tank, just below the seam, and I pushed in the plunger on the quick disconnect with my screwdriver to make sure that at that altitude we had good flow, so we got a good siphon going. It's just fascinating. Yesterday we had a good enough siphon going with the open vent tube, but somehow by closing off that vent tube, it wouldn't siphon from that altitude. I guess that's why I was having so much trouble getting the siphon to start. But raising it up just a few inches there has provided enough of a pressure differential there, enough gravity to get it to flow. So I'm going to restart the generator and restart the test. It's about 20 minutes after 2. Okay, so here we go again. The generator is restarted. I'll put it under load. You heard the electronic speed control kick the RPM up to carry the load, and it looks like everything is running good. So it's about 20 after 2. We're going to let it run and see what we get. You know, one more just quick note here. The generator looks like it's venting through that bypass valve because it did not die because a vacuum was created, because there was no fuel left in the generator. It wouldn't start until I put more gas in. So it was getting a vent. It burned all the gas that was in the internal tank. So now if we can just get a good siphon going here, we'll be in good shape. Okay, just real quick, it is Wednesday morning, the 14th of October, 2020, about 8:30, and the results of our test are that all of the fuel was consumed out of the external tank, and it looks like most of the fuel was consumed out of the internal tank. But there is still some fuel left in the bottom of the tank down there, so I'm going to see if the generator will start and run, and we'll go from there. Okay, so the generator did start and it is running again under a load. We'll come back and check on it. No telling how long it ran last night, but it did consume all the fuel in the external tank. I just rechecked that the vent fitting was loose on the cap of the external tank because the fuel hose is attached to the generator. So for the generator to find a vent, it has to go through the external tank. So it's just baffling why it would, you know, vent until it was down to about half of the internal tank fuel, and then stop. But maybe it was for some other reason. Maybe the generator got hot or something like that. Although that's why I was running it on the 600 watt setting, because that's what it ran on in the earlier test, and it was able to handle that load with no problem. So we'll let her run and see what we get. Okay, it's now about 12:40 on Wednesday the 14th of October, and when I returned, the generator was not running, and when I disconnected the fuel line and checked the fuel inside, it's burned almost completely up. There might be just the slightest bit of fuel left in the bottom of the tank there, but when I pulled the crank about 3 times, it didn't want to crank, so I think it pretty much burned up its usable fuel. So it was able to find a vent through the bypass around the priming bulb up to the external tank. I don't know why it shut down the first time with some fuel left in the internal tank, but it did successfully burn all of the external fuel, and on the second go there, it burned all but a very small amount in the internal tank.